100-question online exam at bpi.org. And once you've passed the exam, the certificate verifies that you have the general knowledge of how various components of the home interact to affect the home's overall performance. So why have we created this? Over the years, we've had a lot of requests from all sorts of people in the industry, from contractors, from manufacturers, from salespeople, to develop an entry-level credential that provides a foundation of building science knowledge. For example, SPFA members have excellent technical training in spray foam installation, and the BSP certificate would provide whole house building science context for that spray foam training. We've also had a lot of demand from non-technical staff and salespeople who talk to customers, who are making informed decisions about products and equipment, and need to know how homes work. So next slide, please. Again, it's a 100-question online exam that tests your knowledge. There's no hands-on field test like our professional certifications. To prepare for the exam, candidates may purchase the companion reference guide to this that covers the principles of heat and insulation, air sealing, moisture control, mechanical systems, and conservation strategies. It's not a BPI professional certification like our building analyst, for example, so there's no certification renewal requirement. The exam can be taken anytime at bpi.org or, if you prefer, at a local BPI test center. And next slide. And of course, as Kurt mentioned, we do have a 40% discount today for all webinar attendees, or for people who are registered for this webinar who may be viewing it later. So for more information on this, go to bpi.org/certificate. You can see a sneak peek of the reference guide, and you can follow these instructions on the screen and use that discount code there on the screen, SPFA discount, to get your discount. And that discount is good through July 31st. And that's it. Thank you, Kurt.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for the brief overview, as well as thank you, of course, to you, Larry, BPI, for extending a very generous discount on your program. I hope people are going to be very excited to take advantage of that. At this time, and of course, we have Leslie's contact information. I'm not sure if, Leslie, your contact information was in here or if it should be going to somebody else, but if you'd like to send me the
Sure.
phone of the person, if anyone has any questions on this program, someone that they can get in touch with, then that'd be great. I'll forward that on to everybody attending the webinar today.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Great. Thank you so much again for that. Claudette, you still there?
Yes, I certainly am.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to hand screen control over to you. And let me just hit the button. All right. You'll be receiving a question asking if you're prepared to show your screen. When you hit yes, you will be able to display the contents of your computer to everybody that's joined us.
Well, let me know when you see my title slide.
You're up and good to go.
Okay, well, great. Thank you, Kurt. I'm happy to be here and share this today. It's a presentation that I was asked to present to our Code Council in Louisiana to address some issues. So today, what I'm going to do is highlight some basic building science principles that provide insight into the interconnections between spray foam, HVAC systems, and moisture, really to shed some light on some of the common issues and questions. Oh, did you all think these letters maybe stood for something else? Well, regardless of that, operating in this industry without an understanding of these principles, these building science principles, is kind of like the blind leading the blind. And I tell you, this first grader was pretty wise. If that happens, get out of the way because the lawyers are coming. essentially, you probably have heard that term, and you heard it in the intro, the house is a system. But what does that mean? You know, our body is a system, or it's a whole combination of systems that work together, and the house is not just a box. It's the same kind of thing. It's a system of a whole range of dynamic and interacting systems that one affects the other. So any change you make to one is likely to have an impact on the operations of the other and all of the things involved with it. And the reason this happens is because, like I said, you know, a building is not just a box in a vacuum. There are all of these various driving forces, and they move through cavities, and they move in and out and all around in various ways. So it can be pretty complicated, but I'm going to try to cover it in very simple terms. Ooh, wrong slide. Okay, let's go on. How heat flows, first of all. We're talking about spray foam, and we're talking about high-performance homes. So to get a real grip of what we look toward insulation and the other components to do, we need to understand that heat moves in and out of the building and around it three ways. And to really be effective, we need to address all three. First, conduction. That's where heat transfers actually through solid objects. Like when you hold a metal rod in a fire, eventually it'll burn your hand. Conduction through a material. Most insulations are designed to address primarily conduction. Radiation is another type of heat transfer where heat moves by radiant energy across empty space from warmer to cooler objects. Even if the air is cold, you will feel that heat from the sun or from a fire. That's the radiant heat transfer. The third way is convection, by flowing through air or water, basically through a fluid. Air carries heat, so as air moves in and out of a building through infiltration, exfiltration, basically air leakage, that is carrying heat with it. So again, to have a really good thermal envelope, you need to control all three. We just talked about air leakage and heat transfer by convection. You know, the typical home has lots of holes in it, lots of gaps, some chases, some bypasses, places where air tends to leak in and out whenever there's a difference between pressure on one side of the hole from the other side of the hole. In general, the most significant leak sources are at the top and the bottom, the ceiling and the floor plane, because of the forces that drive it other than wind. And those are also some of the most hazardous places to have air infiltration or leakage occur. Do you really want air from a dirty, hot, typical attic in your indoor air? But that is what is typical and happens. Another thing we need to understand is the concept of the thermal boundary. What is the boundary of the air-conditioned or heated space? Trace that out in a building, and that is where the insulation should be. But in addition to the insulation must be in direct contact with the air barrier to really be most effective. And they need to be continuous. An ice chest full of holes isn't going to keep your beer cold, and it's the same thing with a house. So that's why in high-performance homing, there's such an emphasis on getting kind of continuity of insulation as well as a continuous, unbroken air barrier as much as possible so that you can keep your beer cold. You cannot need as much air conditioning or heating as you would otherwise. A continuous air barrier is important for a lot of reasons. We know it saves energy and saves money, but it's also a factor in moisture control, in comfort and in air quality, and high humidities lead to a lot of indoor air quality issues as well. So a lot of times we get hung up on vapor retarders and diffusion of moisture through materials, but a lot more moisture moves in and out of a building through air leaks than it does through the materials themselves. Both need to be addressed, but air leakage is really crucial. Another factor that's really important is where you are, your location, what climate zone you are in. Now, I'm from South Louisiana. I'm in Baton Rouge, and this presentation was originally developed to address issues in Louisiana. But I'm going to try and expand on that a little bit because I know many of you are not from the Deep South. But notice on here, we're in climate zone 2 and 3. It's warm climate zone. But look at that little white line that goes, through the southern region. That is the warm, humid line. And you can see we're pretty much essentially almost completely below it. That hot, humid climate zone has some additional concerns and issues that have kind of amplified some of the questions relating to this. So let's look at that. Look and see where you are, what your climate zone is, whether you're dry or moist, and humid or not. The other factor that's really important is rainfall. You can be humid or dry, and it's related to rainfall, but it's a little bit different. We also, in addition to being hot and humid, we have high to extreme rainfall, almost to the point of a tropical rainforest. And we're not alone. You see, a big part of the country and the population is pretty wet. So let's think about, we know it's important if you live in any of those wet climates to keep the building dry because bad things happen when it stays wet. Now you cannot keep water out of the building components entirely. Stuff leaks, every cladding leaks, no matter how well you do it. Things change over time. Wet happens. The key is, wet's always happened. The key is, can it dry? So an understanding of moisture dynamics is helpful to make sure that, yeah, we know we want to minimize the wetness, but we know it's going to get a little bit wet. Can it dry? To understand that, let's talk first about liquid water. Liquid water, tends to flow downward with gravity. We know that. That's why we do shingles the way we do. So it flows downward except when it doesn't. And that happens pretty often. Gravity brings it down, but adhesion properties, the clinging around corners makes it sometimes go sideways or up. Wind can blow water, rainwater, in any direction. Wicking is often forgotten, just like you stick a sponge in a glass of water and the water rises. Concrete, bricks, wood, they're all sponges. Water can wick up many feet or sideways or in any direction through porous materials like that. And then hydrostatic pressure, the water in the soil, there's pressure, or in flood water, to move through the foundation and the building materials. So keep this in mind. Now, in addition to liquid water, which is kind of obvious to a lot of people to be concerned about, we sometimes forget about water in the gas state, water that's in the air, where you can't actually see it, but we feel it as humidity. It moves primarily two ways. Like I said before, through air. As air moves, it carries the water with it, but it also does move somewhat through materials. So here is the law of physics that we all need to know. It's so important, but it's so simple. It applies to heat too, but right now we're talking about moisture. Moisture flows from warm to cold and from more to less. This is so important, I want everyone to say it with me right now. Moisture flows from warm to cold, more to less. Now I can't hear you, so I'll just assume that you're doing it. Think about it before you go to sleep so you never forget. Warm to cold, more to less. So in my hot, humid climate and in the southern region, what does that mean? What is the direction of moisture flow? It's not the same as Montana. So in our climate, moisture most of the year is trying to move from the outside where it's hot and humid to the inside where we air condition so it's cool and dry. And the more hot and humid outside and the cooler we air condition inside, the stronger that drive, the stronger the vapor drive. Another mysterious little concept that's really helpful to understand is relative humidity. We've all heard of it, we know about it, we feel it. You know, if you come down to Louisiana, you really feel it. But we don't always have a clear concept of what it is and its implications, because relative humidity, excuse me, is really not just the amount of moisture that's in the air. It's the amount of moisture that's in the air compared to the amount of moisture that air could hold at that temperature. So it's temperature dependent. And the way it works is that you take a sort of a cube of air, and that air is warm. It can hold a lot of water when it's warm. But you take it and you cool it down, then you're changing that ratio, and cool air cannot hold as much moisture as warm air. So it's the same amount of moisture in that cube, but because the air has been cooled, it's going to become saturated and water will condense out of it. That's what happens when you have a glass of ice water. The water is not coming through the glass from the inside to the outside. It's not moving through it. What's happening is that cold surface is cooling the air around it and condensing the moisture out of the outside air onto the surface. That's condensation. So basically, the phenomenon that we want to watch out for in hidden cavities, humid air, warm humid air, hitting a cooler or cold surface can create condensation. And the point at which it does that is called the dew point. Now, this is what happens when you take, you know, northern walls and you try and put them, you know, create them in the south. You got a warm, wet climate, you got cool air conditioning, and then you go and put vinyl wallpaper on the inside. What happens? Okay, hot, humid on the outside, moisture is driven through the walls and any cavities and air gaps toward the inside, but it stops at the back of the vinyl because it can't dry through to the inside. That is a recipe for mold because there's paper on that drywall, and that is yummy mold food. So this is where it's helpful to still have an understanding of the permeability, the water vapor permeability of materials. And you know, the industry has kind of developed and accepted a kind of a class rating, because it's not black and white. It's not just, you know, completely permeable and a vapor barrier. We kind of often try to get away from that term vapor barrier, because now with this class rating, you know, there are perm ratings that have to do with how readily moisture can get through a material. And so a class 1, you know, with a perm rating it's less than 0.1 is considered a vapor barrier. Almost nothing, almost no moisture gets through, and that would be like foil or plastic sheeting. But there's all this area in between that are vapor retarders. You know, a little gets through, but not a lot, and various levels till you get to a perm rating over 10 is considered pretty vapor permeable. I don't like to use the term breathable, although that's used a lot, because I think it confuses the matter. You know, when you breathe, you think of air, but what we're talking about is water vapor that is in the air. In our climate, in a hot, humid climate, this is kind of, you know, the ideal building assembly where we have low permeability materials on the exterior side. You know, we have our siding to shed the bulk water. We have some kind of furring strip or drainage mat to create a drainage space to speed the drainage. Then we have some kind of material or combination of materials that will provide a vapor retarder, that will provide an air infiltration barrier at that point, and a water drainage plane, a weather barrier. We may have exterior sheathing. It might perform some of those functions. Then we have insulation, typically in the wall cavity, drywall, which is very permeable, and a very permeable finish such as latex paint. So here, you know, we try and stop moisture on the outside from getting in the wall cavity as much as possible, but make sure that the interior surface is very permeable, so what does get in there can readily come through and dry to the inside. In cold climates, you want to kind of just the opposite, sort of in reverse. But there are ways to have all climate assemblies, all climate solutions, and generally using one way to do that is with a rigid foam or a closed cell type foam material, kind of in either on the exterior side or sort of in the middle of the assembly. And the reason this works in every climate, if you have enough thickness of the foam, is that, you know, you think, well, okay, in the summertime, here's this foam board on the exterior side. It acts as a vapor barrier. You know, moisture can't get through it. Well, that's good for the south, and that's good for summer. But isn't it a problem for colder weather when things reverse and go in the opposite direction? Well, if the foam is thick enough for the climate, it really isn't a problem because that inner surface of the foam stays warm enough. It does not get cold enough to reach dew point and to cause condensation within the wall cavity. So that's why this kind of assembly really is, you know, with the right level of R value in that foam, is an all climate kind of solution. We talked about moisture, we talked about liquid water, we talked about moisture in terms of its travel and transfer through the building, but let's also talk a little bit, I want to bring up humidity in the indoor air. That's a big issue for us, and it is in many humid conditions, and it's kind of the opposite issue in cold climates. There's an optimal zone for health, to minimize bacteria, viruses, fungi, dust mites, you know, respiratory infections. And that optimal zone is the relative humidity of the indoor air being 40 to 60%. You know, in our climate, when homes are very leaky, the air conditioner runs constantly. You know, we have big utility bills, but it runs a lot, so it dehumidifies a lot. And so we get pretty good dehumidification. But in high-performance, energy-efficient homes that are very tight, you're reducing that need for air conditioning. You're reducing the heat gain and the heat gain to it. So you have very little air conditioning load, and as a result, we don't have much need to cool the air, but we have the same need we've always had to dehumidify. And so that's where you can get sometimes an imbalance, you know, and humidity issues arising when you start developing a really good thermal envelope and airtight building. So for indoor humidity control, particularly you know, in energy efficient homes, especially in our climate, but this can apply to a lot of climates, you know, it's really good to have thorough vapor barrier under the slab or the subfloor or the crawl space, you know, to do water transfer control and vapor control through that foundation system. Good effective exhaust fans at the moisture generation points, right-sized air conditioning, bigger's not better, and then looking at the details to make sure you have at least 25% dehumidification capacity. Super high efficiency air conditioners sometimes sacrifice the latent capacity, the dehumidification capacity, and so that might be fine for Arizona, but not too good for us. And so if all of that doesn't quite cut it and get to maintain that good relative humidity in a really energy efficient home, sometimes we need to go ahead and invest in a dehumidifier to, you know, to deal with that latent load. But first and foremost, many people really don't understand in our part of the world that bigger is not better when it comes to air conditioning. Oversized air conditionings are a bad idea in every way, except when you have the giant party on the 4th of July. That's what they want to get their air conditioner for, and then they're clammy and uncomfortable and waste energy, waste money the rest of the time. The equipment also doesn't last long. But the biggie here in terms of what we're talking about is less comfort because of poor dehumidification. So sizing is crucial, and it's still quite common here. Okay, it's still quite common here for people to size just by a rule of thumb. And the old rule of thumb worked pretty well in the old days, you know, with homes built around the 70s and 80s, but in an energy efficient home, it's a disaster. And ducts generally are put in one size fits all, and that doesn't work well either. There are 7 healthy housing principles for healthy homes and healthy indoor air, and one of them is proper ventilation. We do need managed and correct ventilation for the building envelope and the climate and the conditions. First of all, if there are any combustion appliances, that needs correct ventilation, supply and exhaust air for combustion, and if that equipment is within that thermal or an air barrier boundary, then we would say direct vent sealed combustion is the way to go, and everything else should be outside that air barrier boundary. We also need local exhaust ventilation, which is pretty common, you know, at the moisture generation points to really pull that out in a quick, effective way. And rather than a constant, you know, it's much better if you have spot ventilation in an as-needed way. Fresh air ventilation is still needed. We want to build tight but vent right to get just enough fresh air to dilute contaminants that are produced just by living and by the materials in the home. And then we need control of airflow to filter the air that we bring in, to distribute it, but to try and minimize the energy penalty and manage the humidity. So spot ventilation, it needs to work. And to work, but we want it to be energy efficient. So go for Energy Star, but it needs to be quiet. People aren't going to use it if it isn't quiet. So low zone. And then the ducts need to be installed properly. Smooth curves, large smooth ducts to manufacturer spec. You never see it, but it needs to occur, because otherwise you're only getting a fraction of the exhaust airflow that it was rated at and designed for. So quiet fans with proper duct insulation. What about the fresh air? Fresh air ventilation. How much and what's the best way to bring that in? That's a hotly debated issue. ASHRAE, you know, had a 62.2 standard for residential, and they just updated it. They just changed it, and there's a lot of you know, kind of debate and sort of battle going on in the whole, you know, building science community about how much is needed, especially for residential. And part of the issue is the concern for my climate, the hot, humid climate. Bringing a lot of fresh air, you know, can add a lot of moisture. And then that's a pollutant in and of itself when the purpose of ventilation is good indoor air quality. So essentially, with all these old and new and, you know, competing, perhaps coming future standards, this is the basic formula of what's out there. 7.5 CFM cubic feet per minute per person, plus anywhere from 1 to 3 more per 100 square feet of conditioned area. For our climate, that's really a lot. You know, that comes out to, if it's 1 CFM, that comes out to 50 for a typical 2,000 square foot house. If it's 3, that comes out to 90. That can really add some moisture load. So basically, the system needs to be controllable, and that's what's really important. So if you know, if the house is a little bit leaky, you need less. If you have fresh air ventilation, you probably need less. You know, and so there's a lot of factors that we don't have time to discuss today, and so, you know, do look into the debates that are occurring. But the issue that I want to bring up here is we do need some fresh air. And in the old days, and lots of current homes today in my part of the world, people think natural ventilation is the way it ought to be. And what typically happens in residential is the only ventilation systems, mechanical systems put in, are exhaust only. Are these a good strategy? Well, take a look at these illustrations. The one on the left shows what's typical in our part of the world. Our air conditioning systems and our ductwork are in vented attics, and they leak a lot. Typical is 20 to 30% energy loss through them and leaks. So when they leak, they draw air from the home, they leak into the attic, which is outdoor space, cause a negative pressure like a suction, and it's driving air infiltration into the home. Is this the best way to ventilate? And actually what happens is not just that, but like the picture on the right, we go in our bedrooms, we shut the door for a little privacy, so what happens? There are no transfer grills, just a little undercut of the door, so you end up pressurizing the rooms, causing air exfiltration through the building cavities and envelopes, which, you know, is not good in our climate. And then the common area goes negative, creates a suction, and we're drawing in makeup air, generally through the crawl space in the attic. Not your healthiest source. And all of this forces duct leakage in attics, in vented attics, creates a negative pressure. And that is exactly what we should avoid in the South, because that's what leads to driving in hot, humid air and moisture and condensation and mold. And it also leads to backdrafting. In our climate, in a warm, humid climate, the best practice is to aim for a slight positive pressure and to try to avoid negative pressure as much as possible, except in short durations when you're trying to exhaust, you know, the big pot of gumbo cooking. Now, air handler and duct locations, you know, there's lots of options. What's typical in our part of the world is everything in, you know, leaky ductwork, leaky units in a hot vented attic. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's convenient. And so what are really better alternatives to that? Well, the best thing to do is to push all that down below the insulated, airtight ceiling. Have everything within that normal condition living space below the ceiling. An air handler in a closet. But that takes up space. It's hard to do. It messes up the construction sequencing. It can be done, but it's a real design and construction commitment and challenge that is difficult to get adopted. So there are two good alternatives. One is the concept of the unvented attic, basically changing that boundary from the ceiling, that thermal and air barrier boundary from the ceiling to the roof, and then the attic becomes semi-conditioned space. So losses are really to your conditioned space. And then the other option is to really do a fabulous job of sealing all the ductwork, getting perfectly airtight HVAC system, and putting it in, you know, with plenty of insulation and mastic, not duct tape, making sure nothing leaks, test it, and having a perfectly airtight, well-insulated ceiling. In our climate, radiant barriers under the roof, you know, and good attic ventilation so that you don't have as much loss. That's hard to accomplish in the real world down here as well. So that's why there's been growing interest in the concept of the unvented attic, changing that thermal boundary from the ceiling to the roof line. And so you see what it does is when we have our ductwork and our air conditioning system in that attic, it's still in the same place. It just puts it within the conditioned space, which is really kind of a big plus to save energy and in a high-performance home. So this kind of depicts, so it eliminates that situation of creating the negative pressure, of driving air infiltration because you're having losses to the outdoors in a vented attic. So it has kind of that double benefit for us. So an unvented attic system, it's one way to create a solution, and it has several advantages. You eliminate losses to the outside, save energy, you prevent that negative pressure, which is bad in our climate, stops entry of the humid air, that results from that. It calls for, not only enables, but calls for downsizing the air conditioning system. So that's a cost offset. You can save some money on the size of the system, apply it to the more expensive insulation system. There's no need to air seal the ceiling. In fact, it should be leaky to communicate with that space because now it's conditioned space. So you don't have to invest in air sealing details of the ceiling. You don't need ICAT cans. There's a little bit of savings there. You don't need attic and soffit vents. And that's good in our hurricane zone because then you don't have wind-driven water. But, and then it makes, convenient to deck the attic floor for easy access to your equipment. It's a clean, comfortable attic space. So a lot of pluses, but there are some issues, and it has to be done right, and there are some recommendations associated. Some are code requirements, some are just, good ideas, good practices. Essentially, the code requires that if you have the sealed unvented attic, that the insulation system, the insulation under the roof deck be an air impermeable insulation system under the roof deck, which pretty much dictates there needs to be some spray foam involved to provide that air impermeable layer. It can be a combo, or it can be any insulation if you have enough rigid foam above the roof deck. The idea is to have a system that prevents water condensation at the ridge in winter, which tends to happen from warm, humid air rising. The other issue is an unvented attic needs to really be unvented. There should be no vents, no air leaks to the outside. Needs to seal and block at the roof wall juncture, and in our climate, if you start putting vents in it for one reason or another, which I'll get in a bit, then you're bringing in lots of humid air into a place that's only partially conditioned, the moisture entry. You have cold ducts in there, you're going to get condensation, mold, wet ceiling. Not good. So there should be no vents in the unvented attic that's got air conditioning in there. This then attic is semi-conditioned space. It should not be isolated from the living space. It needs to communicate with it. And in a very hot, humid climate, you generally will need some air conditioning supply and a return pathway to the rest of the house. By one way or another to help deal with just our high humidity load that's in the house and that's generated within it. There should be, recommendation is no combustion equipment should be in that unvented attic except direct vent sealed combustion types, same as you wouldn't put it in your living room with a big hole in the wall for combustion air. It shouldn't be here either, even more importantly, because it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. That's an air quality hazard, a life safety hazard, and a moisture hazard in our climate. Proper installation, of course, curing and safety are paramount, and this is where SPFA and their programs can be a huge, huge benefit. Workers should be trained to have protective gear, and no occupants, no one else should be in the home until the insulation is completely cured. In addition, there's the ignition barrier. The code requires it. Some products have ES reports where they're approved without it, or you can have an intumescent coating or gypsum or another thermal barrier cover. Some recommendations are that it's good if the roofing underlayment is a low perm underlayment, like synthetic roofing felt, not the paper type, or the adhesive peel and stick membrane. Both of those will stop vapor drive in our hot, wet climate from being driven into the decking. You know, water gets under the shingles, and there can be some vapor drive there. So it will prevent that, and that will prevent movement of the decking, which can cause buckling. And it can also, you know, be helpful, you know, for you know, the whole moisture dynamic issue. It's also helpful, the roofing, if there are shingles, they will get a little bit hotter. Temperature, color is a much bigger impact on the temperature than having insulation under, but it does have some effect. So it's best to have metal tile slate roofs or lighter colors, high quality shingles, and best yet would be Energy Star cool roofing type systems. Particularly in our climate, and that helps too, since you probably won't use as much R value in an unvented attic as you would if you insulated the attic floor. In Louisiana, we prefer open cell, and it's fine in our climate, and that gives us a little lower risk in case there really is any roof leakage, which is pretty common because we're a hurricane zone and we're very rainy. R value, I prefer to see the same R value that the code would require on the attic floor, but understanding that, you know, there's a cost point of diminishing return, we want to see at least R20. R value is R value, and you need at least as much as you have in the wall system to deal with winter time, but we like to see a little more than that in the roof unless you have a cool roof kind of situation, because that's where our big heat load is. There should be no insulation on the attic floor. Just, you don't do it both places, just one. In a high performance home, basically an airtight, energy efficient home, you know, as you get when you do unvented attics and foam homes in particular, but it can be foam or it can be any insulation with a good air barrier. You know, if you've got good R value, good continuous insulation, and then that really has a big impact on the HVAC system. If there's an unvented attic, my recommendation is it should be all electric, or if there is gas, the gas should be only the direct vent sealed combustion type if it's in the attic, or it should be outside the building envelope, outside the thermal envelope and the air barrier envelope. In our climate, it's best to have a little bit of air conditioning supply into the space and make sure that it communicates well with the rest. Air conditioning must be right-sized, downsized to what Manual J requires, Manual D duct design, and because we do need some fresh air, we highly advocate build tight and control your ventilation. Bring in fresh air from an inlet at a clean location where you know it's coming from rather than from building cavities. And there's a filter, and there's a damper, and there's a flow controller that you can adjust. So you bring in the right amount for good air quality, but not too much to not moisture load the home. If supplemental dehumidification is a big issue for us, and the tighter the home, the more it's an issue, again, because the air conditioning won't run as much. And so it's not taking out as much moisture, and so we need a good way to deal with the latent load that doesn't change when we become more energy efficient. There are various strategies to do that, depending on the size of the home and its configuration. Instead of having just one air conditioner, divide the load among two different smaller units, so that when there's partial load in the shoulder seasons, just one will run, and you'll get better dehumidification. Another way is to go with 2-speed air conditioning. Combine that with an inexpensive portable Energy Star dehumidifier with a drain, and you know, in a closet behind a louvered door or someplace, It makes a little noise, it generates a little heat, but that's the price we have to pay for some dehumidification. Another option are very variable capacity, ENC motor or dual compressor air conditioners that really widely vary their capacity to deal with dehumidification. And another option is getting a whole house dehumidifier separate from the air conditioning system, so that when you don't need cooling at all you need is dehumidification, you get it. And so it's kind of the optimal or the best of both worlds in doing that. What about spray foam? Well, we're talking about spray foam, and have a lot of questions about it. And what are our recommendations for, we talked about unvented attics, but what about walls? Spray foam is really a perfect solution for the band joist between floors because it insulates and air seals in one step, so it's a great option there. In walls, it's fine to have either open cell or closed cell. Both work well. I often get questions, isn't it going to trap moisture and the closed cell going to trap moisture? That's not the issue here. Remember, it's like that insulation on the exterior. The foam board is the same kind of thing. If you have the right amount of R value, you're not going to reach dew point and you're not going to get hidden condensation. So since open cell is generally a sufficient R value and it's less expensive in our climate, it's often the foam of choice for walls in our climate. You still need to caulk the top and bottom plates because you're not foaming them. But a unique opportunity and strategy for us in uncertain flood zone areas like New Orleans is to use closed cell partial fill, and it's in what we kind of have called flood hardy or the wash and wear building assembly. It adds strength, but it also is a flood resistant material, so it's a way that we can insulate where we can't elevate above the potential flood because it's for existing homes or it's dependent on levees, what I call levee vulnerable, rather than levee protected kind of areas. So it's another option there. What about under raised floors? We, because we have a lot of flood zones, we generally have a lot of areas where we have base flood elevations higher than the ground. And, we don't do basements down here because, they become swimming pools. So our water table is so high, so when we elevate or slab on grade. But under the floor, in the old days, there was no insulation under the floors down here, and everything was fine. And then Katrina came, more homes had to be built in a raised way, and we had energy codes for the first time, and so we had to insulate. So we had lots of buckled floors, lots of problems. And that is because of that same warm to cold, more to less moisture dynamics. Moisture wants to go up, condenses on the cool subfloor because we're air conditioning, which is kept even cooler by the insulation, and it causes moisture problems. So we were involved with a study by the Forest Products looking at alternative insulation systems, and essentially, rigid foam board encapsulating the entire subfloor system, taped and sealed, or closed cell foam were the two subfloor insulation systems that shined, that kept the subflooring at a stable moisture content year-round, no matter how cool people air conditioned. And so what we're looking at is if you're going to spray foam, closed cell is the better choice under the floor. And if it's completely open, raised area, kind of pier and beam, we think in our climate you don't really have to coat the joists, but in colder climates and also where you have foundation walls, limited, that's kind of semi-enclosed, then it's prudent to coat the joists as well. In summary, Our spray foam recommendations geared primarily toward our climate, though I put a little extra information here. For unvented attics, our recommendations are no vents, so no gas except for direct vent sealed combustion equipment only. That's been a big issue. It's happening a lot down here where people already have gas furnaces. They're being converted and they're not getting enough combustion air. In a hot, humid climate, it's good to have a little bit, a register, a little bit of supply air going into that unvented attic. I recommend a low perm underlayment under shingles, the roofing. The shingles should be light in color, or you can go with metal or tile. And we prefer open cell in a very rainy, hot Louisiana climate. But in colder climates, you need closed cell because you need that lower perm that it provides to prevent wintertime issues, moisture issues. In conversions from vented to unvented attics in existing homes, all of the above still apply, and we strongly recommend that to make sure that conversion is effective and that unvented attic is sealed airtight and truly unvented, is to test with blower door. And we also recommend removing the attic floor insulation and letting communication occur between the interior space and that new semi-conditioned unvented attic. In vented attics, we would recommend in our climate a radiant barrier under the roof or the rafters. With an airtight ceiling, foam can be used to make that ceiling airtight and then topped with another insulation or just foamed all the way. And that the ducts and the air handler unit be sealed with mastic, tight, and tested for leakage. Walls can be either open or closed cell. Either one are fine, really in any climate. And but the plates still need to be caulked. In raised floors, closed cell only, open cell. We don't really know. We tried looking at open cell with the vapor barrier paint skin. It didn't quite meet the threshold of protection, target that moisture content that we were looking for in the subfloor. So, maybe some more research is needed there. And if it's skirted, coat the joists. For more information, there are some great sources. BuildingAmerica.gov has a new solution center with lots of information in various forms to make it more user-friendly for people, so I strongly suggest you look there. There's also building guides by climate zone and articles on many topics with research findings at buildingscience.com. Florida Solar Energy Center is a great source of research in these areas as well, particularly for our climate. This is our Louisiana Energy Office website. Our own website at La House Resource Center is, you can just Google La House or lsuaccenter.com, and we have a lot of information, particularly for consumers, that you can refer people to in the My House button. Or see information about our exhibit house. But we also include on there, through partnership with Building Media, is an online training center, and there's some free CEU type courses as well as free video libraries about building science in our hot, humid climate. So some free resources you can use there. This concludes my presentation, and I'd like to open it up to questions if we have time.
That's fantastic. Claudette, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. All right. Well, this is Kurt again. Thank you so much for your presentation. I just want to quickly share before we go to a couple of questions that we've had submitted that I sort of did throw Claudette right into her presentation. I was rushing myself right before the webinar, ironically, because we had a large storm last night and we had a little bit of a roof issue. So I was dealing with that this morning and had some water issues in the house here. But I'm sorry that I didn't spend more time on your introduction. I just want to remind everybody that Claudette Reichel is a professor, extension housing specialist, and director of the La House Resource Center in Louisiana. I would at Louisiana State University Agricultural Center. If you could, Claudette, just in the elevator version, you mentioned it, but could you just give folks a quick overview of what La House is?
Oh, okay. Well, a house is, it's kind of a big life-size permanent exhibit of sustainable high-performance housing technologies. We had the opportunity to, through a lot of partnership with both industry and private sources, raise funds, and it's built with 4 different high-performance building systems to show, various ways you can apply building science principles to achieve high, green building energy efficiency, as well as disaster resistance, hurricane, flood, termite, moisture, and decay resistance, and healthy home concepts. So it is here on the LSU campus. It's open to the public Monday through Friday, and we do an open house, on Saturdays once per season. It's kind of the hub of our educational outreach programs. Our mission with Extension is really to get research-based information and help to get it out there to people who can use it to address pressing issues. So, y'all come see us sometime, and we'd be happy to host you. But our website is an easy way to get to see its photo gallery and access some of our a lot of our educational information.
All right. Wonderful. And I'll just add one last bit of the introduction that Rick and I have bounced into Claudette on several occasions, but most recently Rick and I were about last month down in Louisiana at the Louisiana Code Council meetings, as well as the Louisiana Home Builders Association. We were invited into both groups to provide some basic overview presentations on spray foam and have some conversations about exactly the things that Claudette was talking about today. The home builders have a fantastic interest in spray foam. They just need to know how to work with the spray foam contractor to be assured that installation is done completely properly, and to raise a level of comfort and understanding and empower them with the type of information we're delivering. And the Louisiana Code Council had also several presentations on spray foam, and we just wanted to make sure that we thank them for those 2 opportunities. And we most recently ran into Claudette at that Louisiana Code Council hearing. She provided a portion of this presentation, and we thought that it would be very informative and useful for folks to be able to see this information, which is why we wanted to deliver it by a webinar. So I can go to some questions. I think we have a handful submitted, Claudette. Let me open those up. Hold on just one second. All right. This one relates back to an age-old question in the spray foam industry. This one was submitted that states, why calling out low-density open cell foam at the roof line would closed cell not be appropriate? So I believe that that's going back maybe about 15 minutes, roughly, into a reference into your presentation. Can you explain the approach and information that you shared between regarding open cell and closed cell foam at the roof line?
There are, each one is an option. We prefer open cell in our climate because of our extreme rainfall tendency, and because roof damage in hurricanes is the most common kind of damage, and with the loss of the roof covering, the open cell is much more permeable, and so it would allow drying to the inside. It would help to allow the opportunity for the roof decking, the wood, to dry if things did get a little bit of moisture, either through vapor drive or through a little bit of leakage. And because we're a mild climate, we can use open cell in our climate without wintertime moisture issues, and it can provide the adequate R value for our mild climate as well. So because of that, there's a little bit of lower risk. That is our preference. Now, the closed cell does offer advantages of more R value, per inch, but also it does add structural benefits. So, and that's a hurricane benefit as well, in terms of tying, helping to adhere everything together and reduce the chance of losing your roof decking. But if closed cell is used, we would recommend having a adhesive peel and stick membrane underlayment because that is the most robust protection from either water vapor drive or from leakage if you do lose some of your roof covering.
Okay, wonderful.
However, in colder climates, and climates that are less rainy, that kind of tips the scale. In cold climates, you need the vapor retarder or vapor barrier effect. You need some kind of vapor barrier on the interior side, and so closed cell foam would inherently provide that. So it's the preferred choice in colder climates.
Okay. With the benefits of closed cell spray foam applied to the underside of the roof deck with regards to wind uplift, shouldn't you avoid a low perm underlayment to avoid a vapor trap?
There is that risk too, and that assumes that that there's vapor could be trapped if there's a breach in the system. And so, however, the peel and stick membrane going on is designed to, since it's adhered, it should prevent any vapor drive through. So it should prevent vapor becoming in there to get entrapped. And if a little bit would find its way around one way or another, the closed cell foam is not completely impermeable. So it would provide a little bit of permeability pathways through. And then there are those in the, in the building science arena who feel that that the closed cell foam has an advantage in that it would isolate the damage. So if there is some water coming through and it damages the decking, it would be a more isolated area of it, and so it would limit damage to that piece of decking rather than allowing leakage into the attic, which could damage interior. So, there are pros and cons, various ways to look at it, but because of the higher risk of roof failure and roof leakage of the exterior roofing material, the peel and stick underlayment would provide the best protection to prevent moisture intrusion.
All right. Great. So we'll do I think there's one, maybe two questions left here. We'll do a time check. We're about 10 minutes over, but we do still have a good number of attendees. I think we've lost maybe 5 or 6. We'll knock through the rest of these questions, and I'll remind everybody that the presentation will be made available to you. It'll be sent around with the certificates of completion that you may need for your continuing education units. And it is also being recorded, so it will be made available to anyone that perhaps needs to download that the copy of this webinar. You can reply to the email that's sent around and contact me directly, and we'll get that taken care of for you. All right. So in my northern climate, using spray foam in an unvented attic has been claimed to create problems with asphalt shingles wearing prematurely. Asphalt shingle manufacturers generally do not support or warrant their materials unless a ventilation is being provided between the deck and the shingle. We now install vents on the underside of the roof decking before sealing the interior of the roof deck to create the desired unvented attic. We have spray foamed a few unvented ceilings where the shingles failed prematurely, and it was claimed because of excess outside heat. Now, I do know, and Claudette is much more of an authority to be able to answer this than I, but I will also point out that the Florida Solar Energy Center has done considerable amount of research on the effect of heat and asphalt shingles and unvented attics. And actually, SPFA tweeted out that a link to that research just a few days ago. It is still available on the Florida Solar Energy website. But it was found that the insulation design of the unvented attic did not have a measurable effect on the lifetime performance of those asphalt shingles. But I just wanted to point that out to folks. It is available, and I will hand over to Claudette to offer her much more informed answer.
Some other looks at it have found that, you know, it's usually, it will, you know, the shingles and the decking will be a little bit warmer, you know, do get a little bit hotter. How much that affects the longevity is kind of variable. It depends more on the color of the shingle and the, you know, the sun exposure. Color has a bigger effect than temperature per se. And so though, you know, I have heard the number, you know, by some of the scientists that they'll probably reduce the life of the shingles, you know, dark shingles about 10%. And so there is some effect there. That is why one of our recommendations was to use lighter color. If you use shingles, use lighter color shingles, and or the new Energy Star solar reflective shingles or other types of roofing. And then, you know, I like to see the impermeable underlayment as well. But what the question talking about putting some ventilation between the foamed conditioned attic and, you know, in other words, creating a vent space between, that is a wonderful, you know, a wonderful solution that eliminates that level of risk. It just adds cost to the construction process. So it is something that that provides the best of both worlds. You get, you know, your HVAC within conditioned space, and you still have some ventilation. And then what could make that perform even better is that top roof deck with ventilation underneath. If it's a radiant barrier roof decking, then that provides kind of a, you know, reduces the radiant heat gain that hits, you know, the insulation part. And so you, in our climate, you could get by with a little less R value if you've got either a reflective roofing material or a radiant barrier roof decking with some venting below it. So that is an excellent solution if you know, can do it, you know, cost effectively, or the client is willing to pay the extra, you know, the extra cost of doing that. And I realize, you know, the shingle industry, you know, has some reservations. Some companies void the warranty with both unvented attic configurations or radiant barrier roof decking, and some just have stipulations on how it has to be done to proper, you know, proper methods and specifications. But again, our general recommendation is either provide some venting between, like you're talking about, or use a light color.
Okay.
Roofing.
Very good. I think we'll make this next one the last question. There are a handful that have come in subsequent to this, but what we'll do is work with Claudette. I'll get her a list of these last handful of questions here, and we'll see if we can answer those and send around the answers on a follow-up email from the webinar. But there's a long introduction to this one that I'll paraphrase it. But even in a cold climate, I find that putting an HVAC supply and returns in UVA seems to control air change and adds to the comfort and efficiency of the home. I'll skip to the end, the question, do you feel there should be no HVAC supply in climate 4?
You know, frankly, I'm not the best expert on there, you know, in the other climate zones, but in preparation and in preparing for today, I did try and you know, talk to some other folks and get some insight here, because in most parts of the country, generally, if there's enough communication between the unvented attic space and, you know, and the rest of the house, you know, it had previously been my understanding that you can get away without having, you know, dedicated supply register going into the unvented attic. But what I found is that really below that hot, humid line, you know, it's going to be needed just because of our, you know, climate and conditions and humidity load. Above that hot, humid line, it's okay to do it. It's fine to do it. It is part of the conditioned space. It's almost like, you know, like you would handle a bonus room, only you're not living in it. But it might not be necessary. And so if it's not a big energy penalty to do that because it is still within that insulation air boundary. So to be on the safe side for comfort, you can go ahead and do it, but you may not have to in the colder, drier climates.
Okay, wonderful. With that, we will end the webinar. I want to thank Leslie McDowell, the Director of Marketing and Communication for BPI, for her overview of the BPI offers, not only on the CEUs as well as RCI with the CEUs, but with BPI's new Knowledge of Certificate program for building science. I'd also like to thank Claudette, of course, for her wonderful webinar. Very insightful, very informative, straight from the jungle of Louisiana. And we will be sending this around as well as the certificates for your reference. If anyone has any questions, you have the email from me on the registration. Please feel free to get back to us. The contact information for folks relative to BPI and, of course, Claudette are available in the presentation if you need those. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining this one of SPFA's quarterly informational webinars that we look to make as a resource for you. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.